Hello and welcome to India on the Move. I'm Shereen Bhan. As the world becomes more and more integrated, it is incumbent upon India, its government as well as its industry to try and engage as deeply as possible with the rest. Our relationship with Africa is going to be on special focus here for the show today. Joining us today, a very special set of panelists, Mahesh Sachdev, President, Economic Diplomacy and Strategies, also the former ambassador to Nigeria, Norway and Algeria. Also with us, SM Sundaresan, Country Head of Global Banking India at Standard Chartered, and Sunil Makharia, the President Finance at Lupin. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Just to set the context now of how things have actually progressed between India and Africa. Bilateral trade with the continent is up fivefold in the last decade from about $12 billion in 2005-2006 to $56.7 billion. India's exports to Africa have increased from $7 billion in the same period to about $25 billion in FY 15-16, and that accounts for about 9.5% of India's total exports. Indian imports from Africa have increased from $4.9 billion in 05-06 to $31.7 billion in 15-16, accounting for about 8.3% of total Indian imports. But there is a huge area of opportunity. What can be done? What are the strengths that India can leverage to deeply engage with the African continent? Let me take that point across to you, Mr. Sachdev. We've seen a significant amount of progress, but this pales in comparison to China and the kind of effort that China has put into building its relationship with Africa, largely on the back of infrastructure diplomacy, oil diplomacy as well. What do you believe will be needed to be done at this point in time to make sure that there is significant momentum that's built to keep this relationship going?
I think India and Africa both can claim to have sizable share of 21st century economies. For example, Nigeria alone would be third largest country by 2050. India, we all know, is on its way to become fifth largest economy right away. So there's comprehensive synergies that are possible. Some of it has been happening, but we could do more, perhaps leveraging our soft skills.
Okay.
In terms of services, in terms of institution building, in terms of healthcare, setting up regulatory bodies, connecting the continent with India, digitally, physically, financially, maritime, civil aviation and others. That way we could leapfrog over the existing statistics that you
So what comes in the way of us being able to get to the point that you just articulated for us, the picture that you just painted for us? What are the impediments?
There are sizable impediments. Funding is, for one, difficult, particularly now when commodity prices are low and Africans are not able to afford those kind of things themselves. There was a time when Lagos was connected by Nigerian Airlines to Mumbai twice a week, but that's no longer true 10 years on. Similarly, there are other possibilities in terms of pharmaceuticals, in terms of healthcare issues. What we have to do is to go closer to the customers, understand them. Africa is evolving. It has among the highest birth rate in the world. Youth bulge has its own aspirations, and those aspirations have to be identified and leveraged.
So building on synergy specifically in the area of services and of course leveraging India's strengths when it comes to its soft power and exporting its soft power. But Sundaresan, let me ask you this. I mean, one of the issues that that Mr. Sachdev just mentioned here was the financing aspect of it in bringing together Africa and India much more and in a much more meaningful way. How do you see that, and what do you believe have been the challenges in being able to achieve that?
Okay. Firstly, trade is a precursor to development. So as banks like us bring our clients on both ends of the Asia-Africa corridor together by industry-specific delegations and by helping finance trade on both ends, we actually lay the path for investments for both parties in each other's markets. and that's the best way for social contribution and human development. Plus, I believe with India's Make in India initiative and then being globally competitive on sectors like pharmaceuticals and automobiles, there is a big market in Africa that India can substitute imports from other geographies like the European Union.
Okay.
So banks like us can help bring together our network, or using our network, we are in 17 countries on Africa with an ability to service 34 countries, bring customers at the Africa end together with service providers and exporters and importers at the India end, and make the connection seamless, easier, transparent, and give security to trade.
So when we're talking about investment from the Indian private sector into Africa, for instance, that big ticket acquisition that Bharti did in Africa, for instance, which captured imagination and the headlines, hasn't turned out quite the way that they would have liked it to for a various bunch of reasons. But that apart, what is the message to corporate India who are looking at opportunities in Africa at this point in time when it comes to outbound investment from India into Africa?
Okay, there are two aspects to tap a market. First is that you service it through trade, and then you finally go and invest. At the point at which you invest, the time at which you invest, is a function of your read of the demographics and the income levels, and thereby what the demand for your services is. So I would say, given the age profile of Africa is somewhat similar to what India's own demographics is. So the Indian companies which are riding the Indian consumption boom will sooner or later find a natural home for their products and services, also because the price point at which we are able to service Indian clients is very similar to what Africa needs.
To the price points in Africa. Okay, great. So you're saying that the consumption story, in a sense, is replicable in Africa. So the experiences that Indian companies enjoy in India could perhaps be replicated in Africa. Just taking the healthcare story forward, because that's one big area of opportunity, as Mr. Sachdev pointed out, and Sundaresan alluded to that as well. Now, Lupin has made its entry into Africa via South Africa and via an acquisition as well. Are you looking at more M&A to consolidate your position in Africa?
Sure, Shereen. No, let me first tell you that African markets is the very important market for any pharmaceutical companies, and no pharmaceutical company can ignore that market.
What's the kind of growth that you're seeing there?
Oh, it's a double-digit growth, absolutely. And our presence in the Africa markets has been both organically as well as inorganically. We have been supplying the drugs to almost all the African countries right from many years, I would say. Coming to the South Africa, yes, we acquired a company there, and this is one of the most profitable company for us. And I have tried to say that that's the fourth largest generic pharmaceutical company in South Africa. We have been looking for many more opportunities there, and first, of course, the South African market, because that's relatively easier market.
Easier market to deal with. Yes.
So we are looking for that. Presently, the Africa would be contributing maybe the 5% of our top line. But over a period of time, definitely would look forward to increase their share.
So what kind of expectation do you have? Where do you go from 5% to what is the expectation of the next few years?
I would say we are so focused as of now for the US and Japan.
Right.
So anything up to 10%, I would say we would be happy with that.
But, Mr. Sachdev, we were just talking about how Lupin, for instance, has made inroads into the African market, both organically as well as through an acquisition. And several other Indian companies are looking at that possibility as well. But when we talk about Indian companies, for instance, two-wheelers, and that's a big market in Africa, and we've got Indian companies exporting their products into the African market, specifically Nigeria. I think Bajaj Auto is the number one exporter and the number one two-wheeler exporter into markets like Nigeria. What are the challenges that they face on the ground that we must keep in mind?
I think the biggest challenge is to supply goods which are quality-wise acceptable and price-wise affordable. I think we have a lot going for us, because African market is, should I say, polarized between very expensive but quality-wise perfect products from Western world, and relatively cheaper but quality-wise not so reliable products from China, for example. Now, in the middle, there is a huge gap. And some of the Indian companies, like Bajaj Auto, for example, have managed to fill that by providing products which are just the right products in terms of quality versus cost metrics.
Right.
Similarly, on pharmaceuticals, now the main challenge there is faking, counterfeiting, and very often these products are counterfeited by someone who has local connectivity.
Right.
Logistics are difficult because many of these countries, coastal areas are easy to get to by sea, but if you have to supply these products inland, that's another one. Again, choosing the market, choosing the product is important.
On that note, we'll take a break, but when we return, we continue our conversation here on India on the Move. Let's talk about the geopolitical and strategic partnership between India and Africa. Prime Minister Modi visited Africa last July, I think it was in 2016. We've now got a context where China, through infrastructure diplomacy, through the One Belt, One Road, is virtually tying up with every country possible, including with Pakistan, which is a sizable investment that China is making there. How important is it going to be strategically for India to engage geopolitically with Africa to ensure that it's not left out, so to speak?
I think our government in India recognizes that it has to be proactive so that it can safeguard the trade and investment interests of Indian business, and also because India has the large diaspora of people of Indian origin in many countries in Africa. So India has strategically kind of allied itself with Japan, and through the Asia-Africa growth corridor, I think both countries will synergistically support infrastructural development, not just on the east coast, which is proximate, and also Japan is helping India develop a port in Gujarat, the Chabahar port, which will be used to export goods into East Africa and also inland into continental Africa. So the government is proactive, using both, as Ambassador Sachdev mentioned, the Indian diaspora, the soft skills, focus on hospitals, focus on scholarship for African students in India. So it's both a matter of not putting dollar to dollar against the Chinese 60 billion
which
line
you
of
can't
credit.
Anyway.
Correct.
Yeah.
But winning the hearts and minds of the African society by emphasizing the cultural proximity and sensitivity to their needs.
Would you agree, Ambassador Sachdev? And also, this business of, as Sundaresan was pointing out, India and Japan collaborating to try and engage with Africa. Do you believe that that will be able to sort of, in a sense, negate the kind of inroads that China is making?
Firstly, I would like to suggest that the complementarities between India and Japan on this particular idea of Africa-Asia growth corridor need to be assembled properly. It shouldn't happen that the investments come from respective quarters and then they insist on the share of the projects in that proportion, as it is normally done in international investors.
Sure.
Secondly, I think it is also necessary not to see it as winner takes it all situation. Africa is big enough for both China and India and Japan and others to collaborate, to work together or work separately. I think there is also a need for focusing on non-English speaking Africa.
Is that the approach that you're now starting to take, Mr. Makharia? Because as you pointed out, South Africa was the low-hanging fruit, easier to do, relatively speaking. How are you now approaching the rest of the continent, given the kind of challenges, as well as the opportunities that we just heard from Mr. Sachdev about?
We acknowledge that there are a lot of opportunities when we talk the whole continent. But to begin with, maybe first we'd like to more focus on the low-hanging fruits.
Sure.
So it would be more the countries near to South African market, which are more like English-speaking countries. We would like to move gradually. That would be our approach, I would say.
Okay, move gradually. Sundaresan, let me get now from you. You know, India and Africa 2020, there's a target that we've set for ourselves in terms of what we would like to achieve for bilateral trade. But beyond just numbers, what do you believe will be the 3 or 4 imperatives that we need to make sure are on the table, we move forward on them to really make India on the move a true reality when it comes to dealing with Africa?
Okay, I think the first suggestion I would make is the government of India and the Ministry of Commerce should partner with the corporates who have the capital to invest. Because unlike in the Chinese initiative towards Africa, which is a G2G initiative, ours is a combination of private capital and government's own capital. So the first is, how can the Indian government provide an umbrella or some kind of a risk assurance for Indian businesses who work in Africa? Secondly, can the government of India, working with banks like Standard Chartered, provide multilateral risk assurance cover from parties such as MIGA, who give you political and commercial insurance? The third suggestion I would like to make is, let's say an Indian EPC company goes and wants to do contracts, want to set up transmission lines, build dams. The particular government or government agency which is handing out that contract, how do we ensure that IFC or ADB or any other multilateral agency, how do we work with them to ensure that project is financially closed so that the Indian business is able to give a quote which enables it to win? All this require out-of-the-box thinking, which the government of India should adopt a kind of a private sector mindset, because at the end of the day, majority of the capital, I would expect, as you saw in the Bharati Zain acquisition, the private sector can put in enormous capital to work. And what we need is a flexible and assuring hand of the government of India to help private sector get gains on the capital that they invest.
How much of this is realistically possible? How much of a private sector mindset and approach can the Indian government adopt? How much of the risk assurance that industry is seeking can the Indian government provide? What kind of multilateral sort of tie-ups can the Indian government facilitate to ensure that this is in fact a reality?
A lot is possible. My own experience tells me that private sector is not necessarily the most aggressive when it comes to Africa. They often choose the wrong bases. They go into the wrong sectors and they adopt wrong strategies.
Is that because they don't understand it well enough?
Partly because the PIOs in Africa, which are a force to contend with, may have their own interests, not necessarily coinciding with Indian forays by the companies. Very often, standalone Indian projects have better success rate than partnerships
with
African companies or Africa-based Indian companies and so on. There is also a funding issue, as we have been told. There is paucity of funding. India and Africa both are capital short countries, and these economies require a dollop of capital to take the projects to their last mile. Many of the infrastructure projects or metallurgical projects, mining projects require big amount of money. Very often elsewhere in Africa, the calibration of their economy and its potential for India is given a miss by rating agencies
Fair point.
Exim Bank or ECGC or banks based in India who don't want to sort of front load the risks.
Sure.
And that's where government can do a lot more in pressing these people. Don't look at it just as your annual input for bottom line, but there's a country interest involved. Unless we promote our exports, unless we stand by our exports.
So that's the role that the government can play. But consensus on the panel that this is going to be potentially, or will continue to be potentially, a big area of opportunity, and that all three of you are equally confident of this being strategically important for India.
That is correct.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And I would say, based on our experience, in fact, the Indian pharmaceutical companies are definitely who have the better scores over the Chinese, especially in terms because of the product qualities, which China.
Sure. So that was the point that the ambassador made,
absolutely.
that the middle, where low cost but good quality is where Indian companies can actually capitalize and leverage their strengths. Well, Mr. Makharia, Sundaresan and Mr. Sachdev, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 as we discuss India on the move and the opportunities that Africa throws up and how we can actually build on this relationship and this partnership for the future. Thank you very much for your ideas, your suggestions and your time. Thanks very much for joining us. With that, it is time for us to wrap up the CNBC TV 18 special from all of us here. Goodbye and many thanks for watching.
Focus. Ideate. Innovate. Enable.